Hi, everyone. My name is Danielle Jacquet, and I will be talking about normalizing the complexities of grief in this Focus on Wellness presentation. So Focus on Wellness is a free monthly webinar offered through Eden's Counseling Group, and it covers a variety of mental health topics. So if you have not already, please subscribe to the newsletter so you can just sign up for any topic that, interests you. A little bit about myself. I am a graduate student at Houston Christian University. I am pursuing my Master's of Art in Clinical and Mental Health Counseling. I am a student intern at Eden's Counseling Group, and I am currently supervised by Diana Cabrera Stewart, who is amazing. I love Eden's. I am very grateful that I have a place to kind of plant my professional roots and just bloom. Great support, great community, and so I'm able to thrive in this journey of counseling. So it's a little bit about myself. There's more on my website page over the About Me, which is on the link in the presentation if you're curious. And so what we're going to talk about today is defining the grief process, defining the roles of mourning and grief, identifying why grief is complex. We're going to discuss and normalize the function of grief, as well as instill hope. I will also provide a few examples of tools and resources to support yourself if you are grieving. Before we begin, this presentation may be triggering because we're talking about loss and just grieving. And so if that is something that you are going through, please do not hesitate to turn off your camera. If you have a grief response, take a moment to yourself. There's no judgment. If you want to stay offline with the camera, if you want to keep your camera off during the presentation, that's okay as well. It's understood. I only ask that you be gentle with yourself because what you're going through is a lot. Okay, so what is grief? The definition that I got was off the online dictionary, and it's just that grief is a common and normal psychological response to loss associated with death. There are big G's and little G's in grief. And so big G's are, again, death or escaping an abusive relationship or things of that nature. And the little G's are like moving to a new location or city or transferring jobs. Again, not limited to just that. These are just examples. Grief occurs in phases. It can be acute grief, integrated grief, or complicated grief. There are other forms of grief as well. Again, just examples. And grief overall is a universal experience. Everybody grieves at one point or another, sometimes persistently. It's just a part of humanity. And it's an unfortunate but also fortunate aspect to it. And so what causes grief then, right? Age, how the person died or how the loss kind of transpired. Was it expected? Was it not expected? Health conditions or mental health disorders are also causes that can cause you to kind of enter into this now process of grieving. Living loss, which means that it's not necessarily death per se, but it's the end of a marriage, a relationship, loss of an opportunity or job, expectations, loss of a dream. Living losses very much can cause you to enter into grief. And then grief overall is an emotional response. It is how it shows up within your body, which is internal. So it's called internal grief. The physical symptoms are typically what you'll be able to identify in association to grief, as well as the emotional responses that you feel. So things like energy loss and body pains and shortness of breath are physical symptoms that people can have when they're grieving. And the connection between the physical symptoms is the emotional response. So if one feels anxious, perhaps the shortness of breath reflects like panic, right? Or just that feeling of overwhelm and can't really control. Weakened immune system also with the body, how it shows up, can be associated to emotional responses of just downness. I think there was something I heard a long time ago where there was actually an individual who had a hole in his heart because he was so depressed that it kind of just over time, his conditions kind of developed into that. So internal grief is the emotional response, but also how it's showing up within your body. And so paying attention to those symptoms are really key to identifying grief. No two people will have the same experience in grief in the exact same way. There can be similarities. There can be ways that we kind of bond over our grieving experiences and our processes. However, ultimately, it is definitely unique to the individual that's experiencing it. Grief impacts your emotions, it impacts your psyche and relationships. It can impact even future relationships. So essentially, when someone is grieving and maybe it's something that is kind of shining a light on relationships within their life, maybe they're realizing people close to them aren't necessarily showing up in the ways that they would expect. I think David Kessler in his book, Finding Meaning, mentioned that if that is the case, sometimes it's not that people change. It could be that this is the first time you're coming into contact with maybe this person has limitations in certain compassion or empathy in that area. But outside of just that, grief does impact your relationships, whether it'll lead you to go into more toxic ones because maybe it's unprocessed grief, or the ways that you are connecting it to yourself, or just in general, the way that it's in the present with how it looks with relatives and friends, or just yourself. Because I do believe you can have a friend in yourself. And so basically reconnecting with yourself is gonna be kind of a response of how grief impacts you. And so who you were before the loss, who you are presently during the loss, and who you're gonna become with this process is how grief can redefine you. In her book, her name is Jessie Lewis, and she is a mother of a victim of the Sandy Hook shooting. She wrote a quote that I thought was just a really defining and just brilliant way of kind of just giving that visual of like what grief is and what it looks like. And she said that this journey most definitely was my own. It would be as unique to me as my own DNA. It had only just begun, and I would be surprised at where it would lead me. And so I just love that because it's so compacted with a lot of like just powerful things, right? Like saying it's associated to your own DNA, which is unique in itself. Nobody is the same. And then it having to be a journey, as well as not necessarily knowing where the destination is of where it's leading you, but that you're on it and you've begun it as soon as you identify that you're grieving. And so I found that really encouraging, but also just beautifully written to kind of define what grief may look like for you. And just to kind of have that grace with yourself of that it is going to be unique and it's not going to be necessarily the same as how even somebody in the same household going through the same loss will feel. So what is mourning? Mourning is the external grief. It is the outward expression of how you will grieve. It occurs during the grief process, as well as providing structure to it. It allows people to kind of re-engage with their daily life. So what that means is that it's exhibited for different cultures, cultural practices or beliefs. In rituals, it'll look like funerals. Some people don't have funerals, some people do. Some people have wakes. Sometimes it's wearing black, sometimes it's wearing white, sometimes it's wearing red. Other times it's sharing memories or stories at a family gathering. An example I have is the New Orleans jazz funeral, which is a funeral that kind of allows mourners to express the fact that this is a loss, but they're celebrating it. And so it's celebrating a life well lived. And so in New Orleans, with that specific kind of funeral, the casket is being carried, but you have this jazz band and like a bunch of people going along with it. And maybe there's wailing, maybe there's joy. It's just a part of them expressing that in that public setting to let people know, hey, this is something I'm going through. And they get to define what it looks like. So that's essentially what mourning is. I used a reference because I really liked the visual of better insight into what mourning is, and it is to feel or show deep sorrow, as well as to lament. And lament is just a passionate expression of grief and sorrow. And there's a quote by Maddie Jackson Selectman. I'm not sure how to say her last name, but she wrote a book called Lemons on Friday. And it's a really good book talking about the loss of her spouse. But in the book, towards the end, she mentioned, in order to move forward, you must learn how to lament. And so that's that passionate expression of grief and sorrow, not necessarily the mechanical aspect of it, because that is very much possible to have that, right, going through the formalities if you're going through a funeral, but not necessarily having that connection to that expression of it. Still, it's the expression, right, in the public eye and the statement, but it's not the same as that lamenting over that loss or what you're grieving. So stages of grief are the famous ones that were proposed through Kubler-Ross. I'm going to go with that. She wrote on Death and Dying in the 1960s, and she pretty much coined that process after her own, research. And even she didn't limit it to just that, but it was probably the first time that this topic was given a sort of context or structure to be able to have people feel at that point in time normal for the way that they were processing things on their dying bed, right? Or how family was processing the loss of that with hospice care or just being in the hospital, and just a wide range of different types of big G's and little G's, right? Big griefs and little griefs. And David Kessler, who worked under her, also in this modern time helped kind of separate this linear process that the 5 stages have kind of been, I want to say, just kind of expected for people to just fall in line with. And maybe it's society, maybe it's also the fact that people, when they're experiencing grief, want it to just be kind of wham, bam, and done, just kind of over with, instead of it being this lengthy process, because that causes them anxieties and different things. And so the 5 stages being anger, denial, bargaining, depression, and acceptance are just a way to kind of show you what the grief process could look like for you, especially if you're experiencing these emotions. However, it's not limited to it. And so, as I mentioned with David Kessler, he mentioned that the 5 stages, excuse me, were never meant to help tuck messy emotions away. It was more so a way to kind of introduce what was commonly misunderstood, and that there really is no typical way to respond to a loss. And there's really no typical loss. And so that's I would say the kind of con to the 5 stages is that a lot of times it's giving that, oh, this is a typical loss, or this is going to be the typical response I'm going to have. And a lot of times that causes people to feel conflicted, like they're broken, something's wrong with them, because maybe they don't experience like 3 out of the 5 stages at all. Or maybe when they're experiencing it, it looks nothing like it was described. And so it's just a way to kind of measure and frame and identify what you're feeling. And so in this chart, I really liked it because it's kind of like a wave. And the beautiful thing about a wave is that it is always different, right? So for someone experiencing the 5 stages, maybe this does work for them and it is a practical guideline to the things that they experience because they're aware of their emotions and identify what that looks like for them. Maybe they're not as high in this chart as denial. Maybe they're more so here, and then anger is way up here, but then bargaining and depression is down, and it goes like that because the wave is very fluid. It can change with each individual. And so that's kind of the visual I want to leave when looking at the 5 stages of grief, and just understanding that it's really not a measurement of what your grief process will look. It's just a way for you to kind of give an outline. And another way is through Etnie, I believe her name, Etnie Nathans. I'm not good with names, if you could tell. She wrote a book called It's Grief, The Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss. It is actually a really awesome book. I would strongly recommend reading it. And in her book, she gives 11 phases. So again, this is just like not necessarily a measurement tool, but just a way to kind of identify what you're feeling. And in her 11 phases, I personally like these a lot because it's what I would feel more realistic to what our emotions kind of center around. And the way that she mentioned is that these 11 phases are not meant to be linear It's just something that may be, and it comes in and out. You could cycle between 1, 2, and 3 and never really get to the other ones until maybe a year later, or you're going through all of them, but then you're going to revisit it again. And so it's a continuation. It never ends, much like the nature of grief in itself. And so I really like it because of how specified it is. And so for her 11 phases, there is the emotional armor, which is numbness, hysteria, denial, and protest, as well as shock. And that is, I think, the emotional armor, just that context in itself, is what you're kind of wearing in that initial part of it. It doesn't have to be, though, right? It doesn't have to be step one of these phases, and you recognizing that you're grieving and what this is going to look like for you. But it is just something that's there to kind of revisit, kind of regroup, and kind of process within your own reflection time and awareness. Like, oh, I do notice. I definitely have been exhibiting this, and so maybe I'm in this phase right now. It's just to kind of normalize it for you. So the number 2 is the role confusion with grief, especially if there's a death or separation, right? That's, you're going to be grieving a whole new role that you're going to be a part of. Maybe if the spouse passes away, now you're a single parent, which is not something you wanted to be in the first place, right? The big G has taken place, and now you're stuck in this role of like, I'm grieving, and now I'm in this phase where now I'm experiencing this role confusion of what this even looks like for me as I move forward. Or maybe you lost a parent, and now you're experiencing just associating yourself like, man, I feel like an orphan. Both my parents are gone, and I'm here. And maybe it's confusing because no matter where you are at life or your age, this is now this new role that you're in, that you're actually having to kind of have within this journey of grief. And so I really like the 11 phases, and I would just recommend kind of checking them out, especially if you can get your hands on that book. It's just really good, and just kind of being gentle with what you may be processing. And just to quickly go through the others, number 3 is the 3 Ds: distraction, depression, and detachment. 4 is fear and anxiety. 5 is anger and rage, as well as despair. 6 is regret, guilt, and shame. And 7 is sadness. 8 is forgiveness, which is letting go with insight, purpose, and understanding. And I really feel like that's such a powerful phase that you may find yourself in, or others may find themselves in, because a lot of times maybe experiencing the big G brings up complex emotions, right? Where maybe the person that is passed away is someone that was an abuser. And now you're having to find yourself not only grieving and then this process with all these complicated and messy emotions, but now here you are having to go through this phase of forgiveness, and not letting go as in an acceptance of it, but more so I'm having to process this with the purpose behind it and this understanding. So it just adds layers to what it is that this process might be for you, but it allows you to see that this is actually very much normal to go through. It may not be that you go through any of these. It may be that you find yourself going through it. It's just a way to help you kind of frame it. Number 9 is repatterning, calibration, and integration. And 10 is resolution, and 11 is grace. Now that you kind of know what internal and external grief is and what it looks like, what causes it, we are going to go into being able to say, how can I identify I'm grieving? And so a big indicator is, of course, experiencing a loss, whether that's a big G or a little g. And then also you can identify if you're grieving if you pay attention to your body and what you're experiencing right now in the moment after something has transpired. Because again, even in the 11 phases, you could be in the complete emotional armor, right? With the shock and the numbness, where it's not anything that even gives that this has impacted me. And so just recognizing where you are and what you're experiencing, and what your body is experiencing. Because like we mentioned, even with the internal, it could be physical symptoms associated to the emotional ones that have yet not been connected. And so it's good to kind of recognize and identify, because then maybe you notice, oh, I might actually be in grief right now. It may not be as, hysterical or anything that I was expecting, but I do find myself kind of processing a lot of fear and anxiety right now. And so that's like an example of what that could probably be, as you paying attention to your body. And then, recognizing your triggers or emotions. Maybe someone says something that you feel was offensive or insensitive. That's a really good way to indicate, hey, I'm possibly grieving over something. And again, it's a big G or a little g. It's no right or wrong. You can't feel this if you're in a little g. Just recognizing what's there and what's taking place within you. Another way you can identify if you're grieving is if you have symptoms of depression as well as isolation, because a lot of times with grief, that is very much correlated with that. And so those are ways you can kind of identify. How is grief complex? Grief is complex because it's ever changing. The nature of grief itself is shifting. Think of it like walking on the beach. And when you're walking on the sand, you notice your feet shift and your body shifts alongside with it. And so in a way, that's the nature of grief. It's not that you will ever really have a footing on it. And so it kind of feels like you're just kind of going through this process, which can be unsettling for a lot of people, on top of the fact that you're even in this to begin with. And so grief is complex because of the revelations in your inner world or your soul that is different from those around you. And so essentially what that means is how you process things and what you feel, and the insights and revelations that are within yourself that you're recognizing are different from others around you, or this corporate way that people grieve, is going to make it a little bit complicated or complex for you, because you may find that the way that the society is constructed around grief, or just the way people around you are processing it, makes it feel like, well, maybe I'm not doing it right, or maybe what I'm feeling, you start doubting, second guessing. And what ends up happening is you are robbing yourself of your narrative of grief and how you're feeling, and the awareness and the insight and revelations that you're getting within yourself. You're kind of not really honoring yourself in that way. You're kind of just pushing it aside. And so then that can make grief complex, because the next thing you know, you don't even know what you even feel anymore. Another way grief is complex is not being aware of how to handle and process events and your feelings outside of grief. And so what that means, if before you even got on this grieving process, you were not aware of how you handled stress or sadness or anger, or when something happened in a given day and you don't know how you really respond to that, then when you're experiencing grief, it's going to make things a little bit more complex, because now you're like, I don't even know what I'm feeling. I'm having to identify where I am in this process, while also trying to understand how I even process a process, if that makes sense. And so kind of being aware and having that awareness of yourself is going to be a really strong foundation for you going on this unique journey where you don't know where to lead. Like Jesse Lewis said, it's just going to kind of help you have a good footing to the best of your ability. Because again, the nature of grief is shifting. So sometimes it's not that it's going to be this smooth ride. It's going to be a little unsettling, which can cause fear. But another way that grief can be complex is you're experiencing little G's during the process of big G's. And so an example could be the loss of a child, and then your body having to go through postpartum healing. So not only are you in the midst of just the transition of bodily function, right, of this little G that your body is processing, this change, but now it's also among the big G of the loss of the actual child. And so that makes things a little bit complex, as well as if maybe you're processing a big G and then the little G is just going through a police investigation with whatever tragedy follows the big G. Or it could be that you're experiencing a move that was maybe expected or unexpected because of the big G. So that can make things complicated and complex for you, as well as just feeling overwhelmed. A lot of time grief is so unbearable that you want to shut down because it's just complete overwhelm and overload, among other things. And it can cause confusion when you get to that point of being overwhelmed, which can be complicated because now the things that were giving you kind of sight or understanding insight, it's like muddying up the water, and now you can't really see what's underneath. And so now you just kind of want to just shut down and kind of just not necessarily block it out, but just kind of find a way to be able to not be so burnt out, not be so exhausted or overwhelmed with your even how you're processing your emotions. Those are ways that grief can most definitely be complicated. I want to talk about the little G's because, like I mentioned, little G's can happen alongside big G's, but little G's, if left unattended, can accumulate into big G's. And what that is internalized grief, which can turn into self-hatred and self-punishment, low self-esteem, poor outlook, self-consciousness, mental health disorders. 50% of mental health disorders come from a grief or a loss. And remember, grief or loss isn't always just a death. It can be a loss of a dream, job, and I would even add trauma as well. Physical difficulties. Here's something that's interesting. Arthritis is a condition, but let's say you're in your prime and you're having these symptoms and you know there's no medical, diagnosis that has surfaced from a checkup. And you're like, why am I having these same symptoms? Well, little G's left unattended can accumulate into a big G, and now you start having physical difficulties, emotional disturbances, and the way that it shows up within your body. Medical conditions as well, right? Frequent sicknesses because your immune system is weakened. For some people, it could be frequent flu symptoms or the common cold. It can actually be sinus infections, head colds, just different things to kind of pay attention to or be aware of because they very much do happen, especially if it's left unattended. Think of it like sitting stagnant water. If it's not removed or it just sits there, then it starts accumulating different bugs, the dreaded mosquitoes, bacteria, all kind of things, right, in that stagnant area. And that's the same thing that happens with the little G's. And so there is a cycle I want to talk about that a lot of people who are especially in the grief process, and maybe they have found that they or identify with, man, I definitely accumulated a lot of little G's and I didn't even realize it. And so now they're big G's. So this is a cycle between trauma, loss, and grief. And these are just definitions I've got in the online dictionary. Trauma being a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, loss being the state of feeling of grief when deprived of someone or something or value, and then grief just being defined as deep sorrow, especially that's caused by someone's death. And so complex layers of grief need to be identified so they can be aided in. And so this is a cycle that's not really identified with people in their process, especially if there are accumulation of different things that have taken place. It actually does shift the dynamic of now you being on this journey of processing your grief. And so what I mean is there are continuous impacts of trauma, and then there's traumatic events. And so a traumatic event is something that happens, everyone experiences, and then the most can leave it in the past after it's come and gone. And then the continuous trauma, or like the accumulation of the little G's, leave longer lasting effects. And so what that looks like with this loop is that you have accumulated all these little G's from maybe childhood or just things in your life that just wasn't going well. And they were unprocessed. And they kind of just packed on top while you're experiencing a loss, while you're also processing grief, because grief is its own process within the loss. But now you've added something else, maybe unintentional because it happens, but it's something that's actively being looped back and forth and back and forth. And so a lot of times when you may be experiencing like why grief can be complex, right, with the overwhelming feeling where things are kind of cloudy, this could be a big indicator as to what's going on with you. And this cycle is to help you identify what that may look like, but also normalize that even in grief, if you are experiencing certain emotions and you haven't gotten to the part in this journey where you recognize that maybe little G's accumulated, or maybe you're just navigating through the fact that the death itself or the loss was traumatic, among the fact that you're grieving it, right? You're having this deep sorrow with that. It's to normalize that this is something that happens, but also to be able to help you have an awareness of what that looks like. And so I wanted to talk to you about the fact that complex grief is different from the complexities of grief. And so the complexities of grief aren't the same thing as complex grief. Complex grief is also known as persistent complex bereavement disorder or maladaptive grief. And what that is being stuck in it, especially with other things that are kind of keeping you in that place, versus just experiencing, as we're talking about, just different ranges of emotions and bodily responses, both internally and externally, recognizing your emotions, your triggers, just kind of understanding that maybe there are a lot of things going on at once. And so all of this is kind of, a little bit complicated for you, versus it being like, I am stuck. I can't move past this. I don't know what's going on. And it's been, an X amount of time. And so what complicated grief is, and how it's characterized as a diagnosis, is that it's a persistent form of intense grief, in which maladaptive thoughts and dysfunctional behaviors are present, along with a constant yearning and longing and sadness or preoccupation with thoughts and memories of the person who has passed. And risk factors for this, in the passing of someone in that diagnosis, is that it could be that some needs weren't met in the dynamic of that relationship, or there's maladaptive dependency, or the person is already suffering from a mental health condition, which again can make it a lot hard. Like if you're experiencing a certain trauma on top of having this grief, and now everything is intensified and it's just increased yearning, it could be that you end up falling into that placement where it leads to diagnosis. And so I'm sharing that so you can be able to kind of help yourself see, oh, okay, what would this look like? And there are very common, what I would call maybe symptoms that are associated with complex grief, and that is intense emotional pain, intense loneliness, feelings of numbness, not really believing that this loss has taken place, or not being able to kind of see yourself within it, even though it's already happening and it's taking place. Things are more meaningless and difficult in life for you. It's just harder to do anything, right? That's that yearning, that longing, that deep, deep, deep sadness that kind of just floors you. It's like you're completely stuck. And there's really no way that it can even look that this is going to look up. This is typically seen in the loss of a child, or a spouse, and of course, among other things. But I think even researchers are trying to see if there's even a connection as far as like any genetic characteristics that can kind of contribute to this diagnosis. But I did want to kind of give a little bit of the verses, like complex grief and then complexities of grief. Hopefully that made sense. So to normalize the complexities of grief is to recognize what grief is and what mourning is, to realize that this is a collective experience, and that there are people who are going through it, who have come through it already, or there's just similar experiences that you can relate to. Identifying where you are in the process of grief is very important, what is happening to you internally and externally, and recognizing that time does not heal the loss. I think that's the best way to kind of normalize the complexities of grief, because I think a lot of times it's associated with, oh yeah, time is going to make this better. But of course, the nature of grief is that it's always shifting. It may feel that it's better 1 year, and then 5 years down the road, when you're processing what does the face even look like of this person that I've lost, will completely change that. So time doesn't necessarily heal. It does ease a lot of the intensity as you process and navigate that journey of grief. But time is what I would consider a tool. I know that sounds kind of strange, because it's like, how can time be a tool if it's not necessarily something we can control? And it's a tool because it allows you to have the power and the space to grieve among other co-occurring factors. And so there's an example that I want to share that I came across, and it is something that I feel like helps me identify that tool aspect of time. And so there's a story in the Bible. I go to a Christian university, so I reference a lot of this. And in this story, in this ancient era, there was a time where the people were exiled from, I guess, their land, and it was for 70 years. So they completely were removed. It was a lot of, things that transpired. And so at that point in time, I guess during this era, Solomon's Temple, which is really famous in a lot of ancient texts and things, with how it looked and the worth of it with the gold and everything, I guess, was completely destroyed. And so this happened while everyone was exiled. And so once that time period ended where they were liberated, they decided to go back to where they came from and kind of rebuild this temple. And so what I like about this is that there were two groups of people that were distinguished in this very short story. It's very short. And the first group of people, they were the ones who had seen the glory of Solomon's temple. They could remember it. I mean, 70 years, maybe it was the elders in the community, or maybe it was people who've heard about what they used to tell themselves, maybe being in exile. That was something that they were completely hopeful of, that maybe it was still around, or they would just reminisce on the good times to stay encouraged and where they were at. And so here you have this one group of people who wept during this time. And the time being that once they got, liberated, they decided to build the foundation, because gathered materials and stuff, it was going to take a while. But to build the foundation was something that was so monumental for them that it was met with a lot of rejoicing. And so that's group two. Group two maybe didn't see Solomon's temple and understood what it was and what it represented. However, they were just glad to be, liberated and in this new place where they can rebuild, and they have all this hope. And so they're rejoicing and they're praising and they're being super loud in their songs. But then you have on the other group around the same space. This is happening at the same exact time. They're wailing, they're weeping, they're tearing their clothes, they're mourning. And what I like about what was mentioned is that many wept with a loud voice, and then many shouted for joy. And those two conflicting sounds from somebody just looking at it afar could not be distinguished. They were like, are they crying or are they singing? Nobody could tell from afar off what that even was, like what was going on. And so what I'm saying is that with time, it's out of our control and things happen. So in this new time for them, this should have been met with, the space of rejoicing, right? But I think it's so beautiful that this group, one of the people, decided to mourn. Maybe the fact that they just went through 70 years of whatever they went through and lost so many people, on top of now being in this unfamiliar environment. And although there's rejoicing, it's just now they're just letting it all out. This is their time. They're honoring what has come up. They have created a space within a space in this time that should have been met with like this rejoicing. And I love how both parties coexisted and nobody was like, hey, be quiet, shut up, this is our song time. It was more of like, yeah, let it out. This is happening. While everybody else on the opposite end was having this hope and they were rejoicing. And so I share that to kind of paint this imagery of time being a tool to kind of navigate that grief and kind of just honoring yourself in that. And it looks different for everybody. That's just the story, but maybe in your specific circumstances, it could be, being in your car in the middle of the actual loss and just kind of taking that time to just mourn in there, instead of being present, or however it looks different. But I just hope that encourages you to kind of see how that could be done. And so if you were ever curious, this is a picture I got off of Google that kind of shows what I guess Solomon's temple would have looked like or should have looked like. I wasn't around, but that's what it was. Golden, I guess. So the next thing I want to talk about is hope. So you're hardwired for hope. Resilience is scientific. And so in this, I want to share a study by Carl Richard. Me and the names. This is a study conducted in the 1950s, and it's where he decided to place rats into a bucket filled with water to show how long they would survive. Now, if you are someone who loves animals, this is going to be a very sad example, because in the 1950s, I guess killing rats was good. for science. And of course, I mean, it probably still happens today with this stuff, but I'm just sharing that because it is pretty much very much tragic, the outcome of the experiment. But on the opposite end, resilience, it's scientific. So in this experiment, he demonstrated the power of hope and the resilience in overcoming difficult situations. And so there was 3 trials. And in the first one, he decided to use domesticated rats. And within that trial group, he had like 3, I guess, tiers of how it was layered. And the first 2 groups of rats he put in a bucket. They both did the same thing. And that was, they were in this bucket of water and they kind of were exploring it, going under, checking it out. And as they were treading, they just died. After like 2 minutes, they just drowned. And then the last group within this category of domesticated rats, they were in the bucket of water, and they, of course, they didn't see the other 2 groups pass on. So they were just kind of put in this bucket and they didn't know really what to do. They didn't explore like the first 2 groups, but they just kind of treaded, and then eventually they survived for a few days, longer than the first 2 groups. So it was kind of like, but then they drowned. And that was it for that first bunch. So then he had a group of wild rats because he wanted to see if the domesticated rats didn't have certain survival techniques or skills that wild rats do, because they're out there in the world and ever present. You know, they're ferocious, they're fast, they're swimmers, they're like New York rats, right? They're just there and strong, I guess. And so he took a bunch of them and did the same thing with these 3 groups, introduced them into the bucket of water, and pretty much none of them survived. I think all 34 drowned, and in a matter of minutes, actually. They didn't even tread as long, which is interesting. And so from that, he realized that it's not necessarily something to do with domesticated rats and wild rats, but it seems that there's something to do with hope and maybe a lack thereof. And so in the 3rd group, he decided to introduce hope and support. So he used a new set of rats because the first 2 are gone. So yeah, he used this last group of new rats who were unsuspecting, put them in water in the bucket, and he watched them swim. And before they drowned, he would take them out and kind of let them rest in his hand before putting them back in, or maybe in the next interval, he would take them out, let them eat a little, let them get nurtured or comfort, and put them back in the water. And he did this over several occasions. And so what he was doing was he was kind of rescuing them. And so in this process, the rats quickly learned that in their situation that seems hopeless, where they're having to tread water, that they're basically in and out of water drowning, that at some point they were going to get rescued and get support that they needed to continue to survive. And so in this study, he demonstrated resilience, right? He proved that with hope and knowing that, oh, if I just keep treading, somebody's going to put their hand in, they're going to rescue me again, and I'll be okay. So I'm just going to keep going. 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 And so he wrote that after the elimination of hopelessness, the rats did not die. And so although rats and humans are clearly not the same, the message is, and that's that belief that having hope equates to higher levels of perseverance. And so I say we're hardwired for hope because unlike rats in this experimental bucket of water, we have a history of just humanity going through the process of grief and surviving it and coming out with this new normal that is appropriate and suiting for them and honoring the loss that they went through. So we have countless examples and testimonials and memorials and historical texts and all these things to exhibit the same thing, is that there is resilience in this process that gets you through to persevere on the other side, right? There is hope. And so hopefully that encourages you to kind of normalize even your experience of like, I feel like I'm drowning right now. Like, I don't feel okay. I'm in this bucket. I didn't ask to be in this bucket, like the mouse. And you're just treading and you're going in and out of water. You're barely hanging on. It just feels like you can't even catch a break. But yet still this thing in you is not allowing you to give up. You're still pushing past. You're still dealing with the uncomfort. Although it's overwhelming and unbearable, you're still hanging on. And so it's scientific that you're resilient and that you're hardwired for this hope. The duality of grieving kind of follows this, is that, the unbelief in how you can move past with grief, right? This drowning visual created this world of disparity and hopelessness for you. And so I'm gonna try to explain the duality of grieving to the best of my ability, but it's very simply like that dialectic thinking, that both truths exist, right? And so you're falling apart while you're cherishing hope. The impact of the loss is keeping the memory alive. That's the things we see with like gravestones, where the fact that this is a tombstone in itself represents the loss, but maybe the recipe and the name and everything memorializes that for that person, keeping their memory alive. And as well as like a veteran wall, right? This long wall with names of fallen soldiers that are there that are lost. And it's present, but it's keeping them alive in that memory of what they've done and their service. And so this duality between grieving is something that I feel like normalizes the process of it, because it doesn't have to make sense, right? Hope doesn't have to, just be magical thinking. It's just that you're walking in this direction, holding on to the hope at your own pace, even if it's kind of conflicting. And so weathering through your unique grief process is normal. Even saying that, even stating that, like, man, it's normal, right? That doesn't feel normal. It's like this duality of what you're actually experiencing, but then what is, as well as just throughout history, again, grief is maintained in redefining our loss and kind of just seeing that. And so faith in yourself is gathering the tools and resources you need to see the manifestation of your hope. Because it's all you really need. And even kind of recognizing that there's this duality is still a good place and position to be in. I wanted to give a visual of my own personal example of two songs. And this is a kind of an exercise I did for myself with when I was grieving. And I thought to myself, what is the duality look like? How can I honor both sides of me? The two things that I'm feeling, where I do have this slight flicker of optimism, but on the opposite end, it is just complete despair. And I thought of two songs that I used to listen to. And having sat and reflected, I realized that There's Hope by India Ari really reflected this bubbly, optimistic outlook on it being hope, no matter how pressed down and crushed I feel. And then the When We Fall Apart by Ryan Stevenson represents this unraveling, represents me having to kind of formulate this legacy to carry on, or just kind of process and sit with it and be okay that I can like cry and fall apart and not look presentable in those ways of me processing my grief. And so that duality of grieving is also an important aspect to just making this experience normal for you, because sometimes it exists within that process. And neither one is wrong. It's just there. And so there was a quote I really liked in the book Lemons on a Friday. She mentioned, I think her name's Lisa Turks. And she also has really good books. I can spell her name if anyone's ever curious about that. But her quote was that, when she experienced loss, it was that it wasn't supposed to be this way. It's such a simple quote, but so powerful. And so this art, Kintsugi, I'm gonna go with Kintsugi, which in Japanese, the word is kin, golden, and then sugi is joinery, so golden joinery. And it's their pottery that when something breaks, it's not trash, but it's meant to be put together and then it's painted over with gold, kind of embracing the beauty of the fractures. And so this is actually an artist that I saw on Facebook. So I put her name in case anybody was ever interested. She has a series of different paintings that she's done with this, and her name's Sandra Let. I can Trumfuller. She's on there, and she calls this concept of her art with this Kintsugi kind of face, beauty from brokenness. And it's basically that, we think the shattering of our lives cannot possibly be for any good. But what if it was a way that it kind of reformed you in this new way of redefining yourself in this journey, because um, there's nothing great about grief, honestly. Um, and you aren't supposed to exist as if things didn't happen to you, on the opposite end. And so I think that's why I like this art and this visual, is because maybe those cracks wasn't supposed to happen, but how glorious did it come out and look in the gold that is there, and how it's very much apparent for the person to see, but also embrace this new beauty that came from it. Not necessarily meant to leave them shattered with the dust of all the broken pieces, but allow them to recollect themselves, and to find themselves, and regroup themselves into this beauty from it. And there's other phrases similar to this beauty from brokenness. I think like the imagery of the rising phoenix, right? Out of ashes, it rises. Then there's beauty from ashes, things with this rebuilding and piecing together, even though it maybe wasn't something that you want to shatter in the first place. And so I really like that painting with that. And it also makes me think of another quote by Brianna West. Oh man, names. Where she said, "I thought becoming myself was improving each part piece by piece, but it was finding a hidden wholeness, seeing the fractures as the design." And I really love that quote, because grief is a sign that you deeply care. And you were impacted by something that shook you to the core and broke you. But instead of it being that you were just left in that brokenness, it's allowing you to see that this brokenness was actually a new way of designing who you are in your outlook. And so a lot of times things from these losses can transpire into just like foundations and different ways to kind of honor that, or what it looks like, but ultimately demonstrating that you don't have to get over it. It's not something that's going to disappear because it's happened to you, but it's that, you keep on living, and that you can continue despite what happened to you. And so tools to kind of support yourself in coping with loss are grounding techniques, just ways to ground and keep you present in the moment, such as breathing and engaging your five senses. There's meditations like body scans, prayers, soaking, like charging crystals, adapt and integrate a new way of living, serve as a reminder that grief is a part of humanity and your story. You will get through this, and there are different ways that you can kind of cope alongside that. And so things like self-care activities, journaling, or relaxing walks. And an example activity would be the memory jar. And with the memory jars, when somebody's grieving, they can take a jar and they collect the memories, the thoughts that come to mind, and they put them down and put them in the jar. And periodically, maybe they take every first of the month to sit down with that jar and just go through the memories. It can be done with family, it can be done alone. It can be done in a way to kind of just not have the memory circle, but kind of place them and know you can always revisit and make it your own ritual, just a place that it's there. You can even decorate it, just different things. There's also tools like creating your own bouquet, right, of flowers. And then resources, please refer to the handout. There is a handout that will have the books and articles and websites, and even videos to kind of just support you along the way. But resources are like, as far as like social connections, group counseling, support systems, social media, testimonials, church, nonprofit organizations, temples. A Swedish proverb says that shared joy is double joy and shared sorrow is half the sorrow. And so that it would be a good way to lean on, and that you will get through this. So even if you're not quite there, just finding that way to kind of have something to lean on, or someone to lean on, is a good way. But then also, so is books and workbooks and articles and studies surrounding grief, and individual counseling and videos. There's a verse I really like called, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." And comforted doesn't mean removal, it just means eased, right? And mourn, as we know, is just the expression of it. So it's okay to have that expression, to know that you will be comforted through tools and resources and the navigation of your journey. An example resource was something that Rachel posted, that was a flyer, and it's for a night of hope where, I guess on December 21st at 7, there is an opportunity for families experiencing grief to come together and kind of just share their stories and kind of be amongst that familiar environment and also that shared grief. So these are just examples and ways you can support yourself. living beyond a loss, there is hope. I know a lot of times in the midst of it, it's not believable. And I can't imagine what grief feels like for you because it's unique to you as your own DNA. It must be challenging for you to walk through the losses, heaviness, and unbearable pain. If you would like someone to sit alongside you through your grief process, please do not hesitate to reach out, especially if you know that you need the support. So for more information, reach out to Edmonds Counseling Group to schedule a free consultation. This is their number and their text. And I just want to say thank you for sitting and listening to me and joining. To kind of close out, I think of grief like a sunflower. I read this in a book, and that a sunflower with the dark center, right? It's always there in that flower. And every time it grows and blooms and grows and blooms, that dark center is always there. And that's like that grief that exists. But then like the bright petals, right? That represent each component to you being in the grief or kind of having that central around how you've kind of constructed this new normal. And so I hope that this normalizes grief for you. If there are any questions, please let me know. I am here to answer. So thank you.